Ah, Star Wars. A piece of media so many of us have grown to love over the years. So many of us have deeply rooted in our childhood memories. And anyone who follows Star Wars and is as passionate about as I am, anyone who's a true fan, of course, knows that a lot of the creative passion in recent years has gone away. The ideas and foundation that so many of our childhoods were built on was solid, but so much of the creativity has gone away. So that's what this video is about. Today we're going to take a deep dive. We're going to see how Star Wars started, what it has done over the years, and how it has morphed into this monstrosity that it is today that is hardly even recognizable and unbelievably somehow related to the thing we once loved. So let's get started. It all starts back in 1978. This is when the first Star Wars movie was released, A New Hope. At the time, this form of film, it was groundbreaking, it was unusual, it was so far off from what people were used to at the time, and nothing like it had ever been seen before, which is what made it innovative. So many of these ideas, a lightsaber, someone growing up on a planet that wasn't our own, getting trained to do things that could lift objects and influence people's minds, do all these crazy things. It was so unreal. And it was so surreal to so many people at the time who were seeing these things. And that's why Star Wars was able to thrive. So many things like Star Trek, other space science fiction movies, so many other things, they were all built off of Star Wars. Science fiction movies up to this point weren't taken seriously. They were some, cheesy sci-fi monster thing on an old planet. But Star Wars revolutionized this. It showed that science fiction is a genre that can be taken seriously. George Lucas, just in one film, set up so many great characters and got their payoffs. It took 3 films, but they got there. And the only reason he was able to get to 3 films was because his ideas were so great, because all of these things were so solid to begin with. Without these things, it never would have been possible to create the masterpiece he did. Next up was Empire Strikes Back. This was his second installment, and it worked so well because it's what he's great at. It worked because he took the characters, he took the stories, and he took everything that was great about A New Hope and amplified it tenfold, leaving us with an amazing twist at the end of Darth Vader being Luke's father. And this was the first movie in general for a while, that the good guys kind of got their asses kicked the entire time. And it set up great for the next film because now Luke is in this conundrum. He knows Vader is his father, his mind is all fucked, everything's just gone crazy. And it sets up for his third film, Return of the Jedi, which we all know. The whole Death Star thing gets rebuilt. Many people say it's the weakest of the trilogy, but however, we do get at the end the whole thing of Luke being fully trained, Vader completing his redemption arc, and all that, which was really surreal. And then, after this, George Lucas decided to take a break. He didn't make another Star Wars movie for over a decade. And when he did, it was, of course, the prequel trilogy that came out. This was different, and many of the reasons that we look at for why The Phantom Menace wasn't successful when it was first made was due to the fact that it was very different from the original trilogy. George Lucas was a very innovative mind, and so he wanted to try something different. The tonal pieces of the prequels were much different than they were in the originals. The comedy was a lot less frequent. Pretty much only Jar Jar was the only one who really made comedy even present. The tone and atmosphere in and of itself was much different. The world building was so much different. The galaxy itself was in such a different state at this time. First, we got Luke's arc, a hero's journey, but in the prequels, we got Anakin's arc, which for the entire duration of the prequels was, for all intents and purposes, a tragedy. Because he's built up to be this great person. He's the chosen one, apparently. from what we see in The Phantom Menace. We grow up, we see him a little bit more, and then we get to Attack of the Clones. And he's still pretty good for the majority of this film, but we see him starting to drift a little bit towards the end when he decides to kill all the Sand people after they murdered his mother. And we also see what allows him to ultimately turn later on when he decides to secretly marry Padme at the end. And then, in the final film, in Revenge of the Sith, that's when all these things that were built up over the course of the other two films come to fruition. The Jedi are killed. Anakin turns to the dark side. He fights his master Obi-Wan, becomes Darth Vader. All of these things brewing and set up for what the original trilogy ended up doing. This was Lucas at his most genius, in my opinion, because he was able to create a trilogy, and especially in the final film, Revenge of the Sith, that was so far off, so different, so unique compared to the original trilogy, and so tonally off-putting for some people, and still got it to work. He still found a way to pull it off. And it's genius that he was able to make these films that are so vastly different, so vaguely connected, only connecting to each other that they connect because they are part of the same universe, and yet tell one cohesive story. You see, any reasonable person would assume that everything George Lucas's empire was built off of would be handled in a respectful manner when he passed the torch on. That whoever he sold his franchise to would respect the source material and be able to build upon it, right? That they would be able to take what he did and amplify it. That they would be able to take what he did, stay true to his characters, and create more Star Wars. Well, to quote Harvey Two-Face, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And this is exactly what Star Wars did. You see, Lucas was getting old and didn't really want to keep making Star Wars films, but he wanted it to live on. He wanted his legacy to keep going. He didn't want Star Wars to end with the final installment of the prequel trilogy. And so, he decided to sell it to Disney. And he should have known better, because he didn't sell it to Disney because he thought they would respect his universe. He didn't sell it to them because he was confident that Disney would be able to handle Star Wars well. He sold it to them because they were willing to pay him $4 billion. Money makes the world go round. Sadly enough, Star Wars is no exception. So in reality, the first mistake was made by Lucas by selling his empire to Disney without properly thinking it through and only thinking about money. And that is a powerful source of, influence. But it is what ultimately caused the demise of Star Wars. We see him criticizing what they do now, and we see him speaking out, which is all good and everything, because what Star Wars has turned into is awful. But he must still understand that, at least to some extent, he did this to himself. That if he sold Star Wars to a company or a person or someone who was more willing to build upon his world and actually respected it and didn't see it just as a source of dollars, then we wouldn't see ourselves in the situation we do now. So let's keep moving forward. After Lucas makes his terrible decision to sell his corporation and his fucking soul, for that matter, to Disney, we get, you guessed it, the sequel trilogy. This was the beginning of the end for Star Wars. Because even in the first film, it became apparent that the writers didn't know what they were dealing with. They didn't understand what made Star Wars so special to so many people all those years ago. Because we got The Force Awakens. Many people claim this to be the best film in the sequel trilogy, but I would say to say any of these films was the best film would be to imply that any of them are serviceable. I'm not here to argue whether or not The Force Awakens was the best or worst or somewhere in between in terms of the quality of it among the other two movies, what I'm here to discuss is why it still doesn't succeed on any level. And the main reason for this is because it is hollow. It tells the exact same story that we saw in A New Hope, with little to no innovation. There's no substance in this movie. It makes you initially happy when you leave the theater, because you see all that childhood nostalgia boiling up in your little body, and you get brought back to your childhood initially. It's not until you get some time to think about it, after you come home, that you realize there was nothing there. There's nothing to deconstruct in this film. They're just telling the same story with a new cover, with less good, more boring characters. And that's how the other two films are. They don't innovate at all. Second film, which was, of course, TLJ, was the one that innovated the most, but still not very much. It still used the Force for very contrived purposes. It made Kylo's arc seem bad. It made Rey's whole dynamic bad, for lack of better words, because it tried to send home the message that heroes can be born from anywhere. But the message it actually sent, based on saying that Rey's parents for nobody, was that you might just be super fucking powerful and OP for no goddamn reason whatsoever. And if you're going to set that precedent, then you could at least carry it on. You could at least stick to it. But they don't. They conclude They conclude TLJ with this message. It doesn't resonate well in the first place because you know it's not going to stay that way. You know there's going to be a twist. And you know that Rian Johnson isn't going to direct the next movie because the backlash from this one was so horrible. All this led to the abomination of The Rise of Skywalker. The third conclusive, tying up all loose ends, fucking catastrophe of a film. Some of the most lame rebirths, some of the most disgusting plot points, some of the worst contrivances, some of the worst holes, some of the worst inconsistencies, and the most disrespect we have seen from Star Wars this entire saga, and it is in the final conclusive film. It couldn't be worse. We get Palpatine is back. We get Kylo's helmet is back. We get all of these other different contrived things that happen throughout the course of the film, which I will go into more detail on a different video. But it is important to realize here that this is when Star Wars was disrespected the most. This was just a corporate product that no love or care was put into. And hey, if you love it, that's fine. You go do you. But I don't personally love garbage. Corporate garbage at that. Because it doesn't do anything innovative. It's an insult. It's a spit in the face to anyone who cared about what Star Wars once was. And ever since then, Disney has been trying to redeem itself through a whole bunch of shows. Trying to make Star Wars have a rebirth. Trying to bring back some of the old fans that had left it because of what the sequel trilogy was. And some of these attempts were successful. Like, for example, The Mandalorian was amazing. At least the first two seasons, anyway. They were amazing. They were perfect. They encapsulated what Star Wars was meant to be and what it is. Same thing with Tales of the Jedi. Gave us background to what happens in the Clone Wars. Again, extremely insightful. We get to learn more about Count Dooku. We get to learn more about... I forget what the other ones were. But the point is, there were a couple diamonds in the rough in terms of the Star Wars shows. But for the vast majority of most of these shows, Disney's just digging a deeper hole for themselves. It keeps thinking that it can get us to like materials simply because it lets us relive our childhood. It did this with Ahsoka. It didn't understand why we loved Ahsoka's character, because she was disrespected. They didn't understand why we loved Obi-Wan's character, because he was disrespected. They didn't understand why we actually liked Tales of the Jedi, because then they made Tales of the Empire, and that was mid at best. They disgust me, and they disgust most people who are longtime Star Wars fans, because it's lazy. It's lazy writing, it's lazy directing, and they all just want to make money. That's all they like to do. And we keep buying it, and we keep letting it happen. But I've stopped. I've stopped paying attention to these things. The most recent show was The Acolyte, and I'm not going to dive too deep into it, because I haven't watched the show. But I've heard that it sucks, and I'm not surprised by that. That's why I haven't watched it. And I know that it was given a $180 million budget, twice that of Obi-Wan's. And it just goes to show that Disney cares more about making its own new characters that are boring and bland rather than working with what's there. An Obi-Wan show could have been great, but they fell flat because they didn't give it its time or its resources to be successful. Hell, even a show like The Acolyte could have been successful if they actually set it during the High Republic and not just 100 years before the Clone Wars. If they actually stayed true to what that world was. But they didn't. They gave us the corporate garbage that we've been getting from Disney for the better part of a decade now. And they're not going to stop doing it unless we stop watching it. So, here we are. We haven't stopped watching it yet, sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything if we can't improve our ways, if we can't change how we think about these things, because, again, it's lazy. I guess if there's anything we should take away from this, it's that Disney is not fit to handle Star Wars. It's not fit to control it. It's not fit to write it. It's not fit to do anything with it. The initial decision to sell Star Wars by George Lucas to Disney was a mistake. And anyone can know that in hindsight, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. And now that we're in this predicament, there's little way to fix it. The only way we could feasibly, even possibly, try and fix this is if we stop giving Disney our money. If we stop paying them to see this corporate garbage, because if we do it, they're going to keep making it. Because they have no reason not to. This is why I haven't watched The Acolyte. And that's why I don't plan to watch any more of the Star Wars content that Disney puts out. I'm considering even getting rid of my Disney Plus subscription because I don't want to give more money to Disney. So, like I said, if there's anything we can take away from this, it's stop giving your money to Disney. That's, of course, if you don't like this. If you like the corporate garbage that's being produced, then by all means keep buying it. I don't care. But just know you're the problem. Alright, guys. That's a bit. I think that's all I got for you today. And, this video is a little bit shorter than I expected it to be, but I've noticed that it was a lot easier to get all my points across than I thought it would be. And so here we are in this situation where I don't have anything really left to say with only a little under 18 minutes of runtime. So guys, if you like this content, consider subscribing, giving me a like, giving me a comment, telling me anything I might have missed, something you want to see in another video. I might make a part 2 of this, something a little more in-depth, but this is just something I want to get off my chest. Something I wanted to say to get myself relieved of all of this nonsense. I don't want to keep giving Disney my money, but I'm also held over by nostalgia that I have for this series. I'm slowly overcoming it, though. It's the same reason why I'm not buying Assassin's Creed Shadows, because it's not a game for me and it's more corporate garbage. But anyway, that's all I've got for y'all today. And, have a nice day, and I love you all. Thanks. Man, this series has really gone to shit, though.